What would you do if you came home on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon just to grab a forgotten USB drive and heard your husband whispering intimately with another woman behind your own bedroom door, and she was telling him she was carrying his child? I'm Laura Anderson, 42 years old, living in Chicago, and I used to believe my marriage was unshakable. I had sacrificed a major promotion, abandoned my career dreams to care for my stroke ridden mother in law, all to keep this family intact. For 15 years, I had been the perfect wife, the dutiful daughter in law, the woman who put everyone else's needs before her own. But that Tuesday afternoon, when I quietly slipped my key into the lock of our Lincoln Park apartment, my world cracked open like an eggshell. The soft murmur of voices drifted from our bedroom. Mark's familiar baritone mixed with a woman's voice, too intimate to be a colleague, too tender to be innocent. My hand froze on the doorknob as her words cut through the air like shards of glass. I don't want to hide anymore, Mark. I'm pregnant. The home I had called my sanctuary suddenly felt like a prison of betrayal. The man I had protected, trusted, and sacrificed everything for stood exposed before me as nothing more than a liar. In that moment, standing in the hallway of the life I thought I knew, everything I had built crumbled to dust. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg for explanations or throw his clothes out the window like women do in movies. Instead, I made myself a promise in the darkness of our living room, sitting in the chair where I used to wait for him to come home from his business meetings. I whispered to the silence, I will never suffer in quiet again. The sweetest lesson won't come through tears. It will come through justice. And this time, the truth will be on my side. My name is Laura Anderson, and I used to think devotion was a virtue. For 15 years, I had been married to Mark Anderson, a man I met during my first job at a public relations firm in downtown Chicago. He was ambitious, charismatic, and had a smile that could convince anyone of anything, including me, that I was lucky to be chosen by him. Mark was a commercial real estate developer with big dreams and bigger promises. We're building an empire together, Laura, he used to say, his hand warm on my shoulder as we stood on the balcony of our Lincoln Park apartment, looking out over Lake Michigan. You handle the home front, and I'll handle the business. Together, we're unstoppable. I believed him. God help me. I believed every word. For years, our life looked perfect from the outside. Mark drove a BMW, wore expensive suits, and talked about deals that would set us up for life. I supported him in every way I could, hosting dinner parties for his clients, managing our household finances, and, most importantly, keeping quiet when his business trips stretched longer than they should have. The first crack in our foundation appeared 3 years ago when Mark's mother, Evelyn, suffered her first stroke. She was 72, fiercely independent, and had never particularly liked me. In her eyes, I was the woman who stole her precious son away, the outsider who would never quite measure up to the pedestal she had built for Mark. But when the call came from Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 2:47 in the morning, everything changed. Evelyn had collapsed in her Evanston home, alone, and lay on her kitchen floor for 6 hours before a neighbor found her. We need to get to the hospital, I told Mark, shaking him awake. His first response wasn't concern for his mother. It was annoyance that his sleep had been interrupted. Can't it wait until morning? He mumbled into his pillow. I have that meeting with the Peterson group at 8. I stared at him in disbelief. Mark, your mother had a stroke. She could die. He sighed, rolled over, and looked at me with the expression of a man being asked to take out the trash. Fine, but you handle it. I can't afford to miss this meeting. The Peterson deal could change everything for us. That was the moment I should have seen who he really was. Instead, I grabbed my keys and drove through the empty Chicago streets alone, arriving at the hospital to find Evelyn unconscious, connected to machines that beeped and hummed in the sterile fluorescent light. For the next 6 months, I became Evelyn's primary caregiver. Mark visited exactly 4 times, each visit lasting less than 30 minutes, each one ending with him checking his phone and muttering about urgent business that required his immediate attention. He's building something important, I found myself explaining to Evelyn during her lucid moments. He's doing this for all of us. Evelyn's eyes, clearer now after weeks of rehabilitation, fixed on mine with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Child, she said, her voice still slurred from the stroke, but her meaning crystal clear. When a man tells you he's doing something for you, while he's never around to actually do it, he's lying to both of you. I pushed her words away. I had to. If I started questioning Mark's devotion, what did that say about the 15 years I had invested in our marriage? The second stroke came 8 months later, more severe than the first. This time, Mark didn't even come to the hospital. He was in Milwaukee, he said, closing a deal that couldn't wait. I sat beside Evelyn's bed for 3 days straight, holding her hand and watching her fight for her life while my husband sent text messages asking if she was going to be okay and when I'd be coming home. During those long hospital nights, Evelyn and I began to really talk. The stroke had changed her, softened her edges in some ways while sharpening her perception in others. She told me about Mark's childhood, how she had spoiled him after his father left, how she had taught him that the world existed to serve his needs. I made him into what he is, she admitted one evening, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. I gave him everything without making him earn anything. I thought I was protecting him, but I was really just teaching him that love means taking whatever you want without giving anything back. He loves me, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Evelyn squeezed my hand with surprising strength. Laura, love isn't something you prove by sacrificing yourself. Love is something you build together, brick by brick. What has Mark built for you lately? I couldn't answer her question because I couldn't remember the last time Mark had built anything for anyone but himself. It was during Evelyn's second week of recovery that I first noticed the changes in Mark's behavior. The late-night conference calls that required him to leave the apartment. The sudden need for weekend strategy sessions with clients whose names he never mentioned. The smell of unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, which he explained away as sitting next to women at business dinners. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. The alternative was too devastating to consider. But doubt, once planted, grows in the dark spaces of a marriage like mold in a basement. I found myself paying attention to details I had previously ignored. The way Mark's phone was always face down on the table. The way he showered immediately upon coming home from his meetings. The way he had stopped asking about Evelyn's condition or when she might be well enough to return home. "How is your mother doing?" I would ask when he returned from his business trips. "Fine, I'm sure," he would answer without looking up from his laptop. "You're handling it." Those 3 words, "you're handling it," became his response to everything related to Evelyn's care, our household responsibilities, and eventually, our marriage itself. I was handling it all while he handled whatever it was he was really doing during those long absences. The worst part wasn't the suspicion. The worst part was the loneliness. I was married to a man who treated me like a live-in assistant, caring for his mother while he built his mysterious empire of deals and meetings and conference calls that always seemed to happen in the evening hours when honest business was closed for the day. One morning, while Mark was in the shower, preparing for another crucial meeting, I did something I had never done before. I looked at his phone. It was unlocked, sitting on the nightstand. And before I could stop myself, I was scrolling through his text messages. Most of them were innocuous messages with contractors, real estate agents, business contacts. But there was one thread that made my blood run cold messages with someone named M that were definitely not about commercial real estate. Can't wait to see you tonight. Mark, this is getting harder to hide. I know, baby. Soon, we won't have to hide anymore. What about Laura? Laura has her mother-in-law to worry about. She doesn't even notice when I'm gone anymore. My hand shook as I read the messages, each word feeling like a physical blow. The shower was still running, Mark humming off key as he shampooed his hair, completely unaware that his wife was discovering the truth about their marriage. I quickly put the phone back exactly where I found it and sat on the edge of our bed, staring at my reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me was 42 years old, with premature gray streaks in her brown hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and sleepless nights spent caring for other people. When had I become so invisible that my own husband thought I wouldn't notice his betrayal? Mark emerged from the bathroom, toweling his hair and humming the same off-key tune. Big day today, he announced, as if he were sharing good news instead of preparing to meet his mistress. The Johnson project might finally come through. I nodded and smiled, playing the role of the supportive wife, while something hard and cold settled in my chest. That's wonderful, honey. What time do you think you'll be home? Late, he said, not meeting my eyes. You know how these negotiations go. I knew exactly how they went. They happened in hotel rooms and restaurants where married men took women who weren't their wives. They involved lies and deception and the kind of breathless excitement that comes from breaking promises made in front of God and family. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I kissed him goodbye and told him I hoped his meeting went well, because I was still playing the role of the obedient wife who asked no questions and expected no explanations. That afternoon, I went to see Evelyn at the rehabilitation center, where she was relearning how to walk and speak clearly. She was sitting in the sunroom, working on a crossword puzzle, with the determination of a woman who refused to let her body's betrayal defeat her mind. You look terrible, she said, without looking up from her puzzle. What's wrong? I had planned to keep Mark's betrayal to myself, but sitting in that sunroom surrounded by other people who were fighting to rebuild their lives after devastating losses, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I think Mark is having an affair, I said quietly. Evelyn set down her pen and looked at me with eyes that held no surprise, only sadness. You think? Or, you know. I saw messages on his phone. How long have you suspected? Months, I admitted. Maybe longer. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. Evelyn reached across the small table between our chairs and took my hand. Laura, I need to tell you something. and I need you to listen carefully." She paused, gathering her strength for whatever she was about to say. "This apartment we live in, the one you and Mark share, it's not in his name. It's in mine. I bought it 5 years ago when Mark was having financial troubles with one of his deals. He asked me to put the down payment and mortgage in my name to protect his credit." I stared at her, not understanding why she was telling me this. "After my stroke, I had my lawyer update my will. The apartment goes to you, not to Mark. I've been watching you care for me while my son gallivants around the city. And I've realized something. You're more my daughter than he is my son. Evelyn, I can't accept." "You can, and you will," she interrupted with the firmness of a woman who had made up her mind. "Mark has taken everything from you. Your career, your independence, your peace of mind. You're not taking anything from him because it was never his to begin with." That evening, I sat in our living room, waiting for Mark to come home from his meeting. I had a clear view of Lake Michigan from our window, and I watched the sunset over the water while I processed everything Evelyn had told me. The apartment I had thought of as ours was actually mine. The life I had built while Mark was building his empire of lies would continue without him. Mark came home at 11:30, smelling like wine and perfume and the kind of satisfaction that comes from getting away with something. "How was your meeting?" I asked from my chair by the window. "Productive," he said, loosening his tie. "The Johnson deal is moving forward." "That's wonderful," I replied, and meant it. Because while Mark thought he was getting away with his deception, he was actually walking deeper into a trap he didn't even know existed. The next morning marked the beginning of what I now think of as my education in the art of quiet warfare. While Mark showered and prepared for another day of business meetings, I began documenting everything. I started with the obvious things, taking photos of the receipts he left in his pockets, the ones from restaurants I had never been to with charges for 2 dinners. I noted the times he left the apartment and the times he returned, creating a pattern that had nothing to do with normal business hours. But I was methodical about it. 15 years of marriage had taught me that Mark was observant when it came to things that might threaten his comfortable life. I couldn't afford to make him suspicious. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I visited Evelyn at the rehabilitation center. She was making remarkable progress, her speech becoming clearer, and her mobility improving daily. But more importantly, she was becoming my ally in ways I had never expected. "Have you thought about what you want to do?" she asked during one of our afternoon visits. "I want the truth," I said simply. "I want him to stop lying to me." Evelyn shook her head. "Child, you can't make a liar stop lying by asking nicely. You can only choose whether to keep believing the lies." She was right, of course, but knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are two different things. I still harbored the foolish hope that Mark would confess, apologize, and somehow transform back into the man I thought I had married. That hope died 3 weeks later when I came home unexpectedly to find tangible evidence of his betrayal in our bedroom. I had left my laptop at home that morning, and when my boss asked me to review a client presentation during lunch, I decided to drive back to the apartment to retrieve it. Mark was supposed to be in Naperville, meeting with potential investors for a strip mall development project. The apartment was quiet when I entered, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. A coffee cup on the kitchen counter with lipstick on the rim, a shade I didn't wear, a woman's earring on the bathroom floor. the unmistakable scent of unfamiliar perfume in our bedroom. But the most damning evidence was in Mark's nightstand drawer, which I opened looking for a phone charger. Tucked beneath some business cards and old receipts was a small box containing a pregnancy test, a positive pregnancy test. I sat on the edge of our bed, holding that plastic stick and feeling my marriage dissolve around me like sugar in rain. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This was a second life, a parallel universe where Mark was planning a future that didn't include me. My phone buzzed with a text message from Mark. Naperville, meeting running long. Don't wait up. Love you. The casualness of his lie. The effortless way he added love you to the end of a message sent while evidence of his betrayal sat in my hands. It was breathtaking in its cruelty. That evening, I called my friend Sarah, whom I hadn't spoken to in months. Sarah was a divorce attorney, though I had never thought I would need her professional services. Laura, she exclaimed when she heard my voice. It's been forever. How are you? I need advice, I said without preamble. Not as a friend, as a lawyer. There was a pause. Okay, what's going on? I told her everything. The affair, the pregnancy test, the messages on Mark's phone, Evelyn's revelation about the apartment. Sarah listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. How much evidence do you have? She finally asked. Not enough, I admitted. Then we need to get more. A lot more. If Mark is as manipulative as you're describing, he's not going to go quietly. You need to be prepared for him to fight dirty. Sarah explained the realities of divorce proceedings in Illinois, the importance of documenting infidelity and financial misconduct, and the way that preparation could mean the difference between walking away with dignity or being destroyed in court. But first, she said, you need to decide what you really want. Do you want to save your marriage? Or do you want to save yourself? I knew the answer immediately, though it took me 3 days to say it out loud. I wanted to save myself. The next phase of my education began with learning how to be invisible in my own life. I became an expert at being present while Mark incriminated himself, listening to his phone calls from the next room, paying attention to the details he thought I was too distracted to notice. Mark had grown so comfortable with his deception that he barely tried to hide it anymore. He would take calls in front of me, speaking in the coded language of someone who thought he was being clever. The new project is developing beautifully, he would say. And I knew he wasn't talking about commercial real estate. One evening in early October, Mark announced that he would be traveling to Milwaukee for a weekend conference. Big investors, he explained over dinner. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. We? I asked mildly. The company, he corrected quickly. You know what I mean? I did know what he meant. He meant the life he was building with someone else, while I held down the fort he no longer wanted to live in. That weekend, instead of spending Saturday and Sunday alone in our apartment, I drove to Milwaukee myself. It wasn't difficult to find Mark. Milwaukee isn't that large a city, and expensive restaurants near luxury hotels aren't hard to identify. I found him at a steakhouse downtown, sitting across from a woman who was obviously pregnant. She was beautiful in that fresh, uncomplicated way that made me painfully aware of my own 42 years. Dark hair, bright smile, and a hand that rested protectively over her rounded belly as she laughed at something Mark was saying. I sat in my rental car across the street and watched them for 2 hours. I watched Mark reach across the table to touch her hand. I watched him lean in to whisper something that made her blush. I watched him pay the check and help her into a taxi, then walk alone back to the Marriott downtown. I followed the taxi. The woman, his mistress, the mother of his child, lived in a modest apartment complex on the north side of Milwaukee. After the taxi dropped her off, I sat in my car and watched her walk slowly to her door, one hand on her back in the universal gesture of a woman carrying the weight of new life. She looked happy. She looked like a woman who believed she was loved. I drove back to Chicago that night with a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about Mark's betrayal anymore. This was about a pregnant woman who thought she was building a life with a man who was still married to someone else. This was about lies that extended far beyond our marriage. On Monday morning, I hired a private investigator. His name was David Chen, and Sarah had recommended him as someone who specialized in matrimonial investigations. He was a former Chicago police detective who understood the importance of evidence that would hold up in court. "I need everything," I told him during our initial meeting in his office in Chinatown. "I need proof of the affair, documentation of his time in Milwaukee, and I need to know what kind of promises he's making to this woman." David nodded as he took notes. "How far are you willing to go with this?" "As far as necessary," I said. "But I don't want to hurt the woman. She's pregnant, and she may not even know he's married." "That's unusual," David said, looking up from his notepad. "Most wives want to destroy the other woman." "I'm not most wives," I replied. "I want to destroy the lies." Over the next 6 weeks, David provided me with a comprehensive dossier of Mark's double life. Photos of him entering and leaving the Milwaukee apartment building. Restaurant receipts charged to credit cards I didn't know existed. Hotel records showing overnight stays that coincided with his supposed business trips. But the most devastating evidence came from the recordings David made of Mark's conversations with his mistress. Recordings that were legal in Wisconsin, where only one party needed to consent to being recorded. Sitting in David's office on a gray November afternoon, I listened to my husband promise another woman the life he had never offered me. "Once this big deal closes, we can make this official." Mark's voice crackled through the small speaker. "I'll tell Laura everything, get the divorce finalized, and we can move forward with our real life." "What about the apartment?" The woman, her name was Marilyn, I learned, asked, "Where will Laura go?" "That's not my problem anymore," Mark replied. "She's got her mother-in-law to worry about. She'll figure something out." I had to ask David to stop the recording. Hearing Mark dismiss me so casually, reducing 15 years of marriage to "not my problem anymore," was more painful than discovering the affair itself. "There's more," David said gently. "Are you sure you want to hear it?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The next recording was worse. Mark describing our marriage as a mistake that went on too long. Mark laughing about how I was so focused on his mother that I didn't even notice when he stopped coming home. Mark planning a future that erased me so completely, it was as if our entire relationship had been an inconvenience he was finally free to discard. "How long have you been recording these conversations?" I asked David. 3 weeks. There are about 6 hours of material. 6 hours of my husband planning the destruction of everything I thought we had built together. 6 hours of evidence that would hold up in any court in the country. But the most important evidence came from an unexpected source. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Evelyn was discharged from the rehabilitation center and moved back to her Evanston home. She was walking with a cane and her speech was almost completely normal, but she was still fragile in ways that weren't immediately visible. Mark visited her exactly once during her first week home. "She looks good," he told me over dinner. "Really bounced back." "She's doing well," I agreed, "though she still needs help with some things." "You're so good with her," Mark said, reaching across the table to pat my hand in a gesture that once would have felt affectionate, but now felt patronizing. "I don't know what we would have done without you." We, as if we were still a team. As if he wasn't planning to abandon both his mother and his wife for his pregnant mistress in Milwaukee. That weekend, while Mark was supposedly in Springfield meeting with state officials about a development project, I spent Saturday afternoon with Evelyn in her sunroom. "You've been quiet lately," she observed, watching me stare out at her frost-covered garden. "I've been thinking." "About Mark?" I nodded. "About what I'm going to do." Evelyn set down her needlepoint and looked at me with the directness that had become her trademark since the stroke. "What do you want to do?" "I want him to face the consequences of his choices," I said. "I want him to understand that actions have results and that lying to the people who love you isn't cost-free. And how do you plan to make that happen?" I told her about the private investigator, the recordings, the evidence I had gathered over the past months. I told her about the apartment ownership and what it would mean if Mark tried to claim it in a divorce. When I finished, Evelyn was quiet for a long time. "He's going to fight you," she finally said. "When he realizes what you know, when he understands that you're not going to disappear quietly, he's going to try to destroy you." "I know. He's going to claim you manipulated me, that you took advantage of an old woman recovering from a stroke. He's going to make himself the victim of your scheme." "I know that too." Evelyn reached for my hand. "Then you also know that I'm going to have to testify against my own son." The weight of her words settled between us. Mark wasn't just betraying me. He was betraying the woman who had given him life, who had sacrificed her independence to help him buy the apartment where he planned to abandon his wife. "Are you prepared for that?" I asked. "Child," Evelyn said with a sad smile, "I've been preparing for that my entire life. I just didn't know it until now." That evening, I went home to our apartment and looked around with new eyes. In 3 months, Mark would return from one of his Milwaukee trips to find divorce papers and an eviction notice. He would realize that the apartment he thought of as his was actually mine, that the mother he had ignored and dismissed was prepared to testify against him, and that the wife he had dismissed as not his problem anymore had spent months building an airtight case against him. But first, I had to survive Christmas. Mark was unusually attentive during the holidays, bringing me flowers and taking me to dinner at restaurants we hadn't visited in years. At first, I wondered if his conscience was finally troubling him, but David's continuing surveillance revealed the truth. Marilyn had gone to visit her family in California for the holidays, leaving Mark temporarily without his escape from our marriage. "It's like he's trying to remember how to be married to you," David reported during one of our weekly meetings. "But only when his girlfriend isn't available." The casual cruelty of it was almost impressive. Mark was using me as a placeholder for the woman he really wanted to be with, and he was doing it with such practiced ease that he probably didn't even recognize it as cruelty. On New Year's Eve, as we stood on our balcony watching fireworks over Lake Michigan, Mark put his arm around me and said, "This is going to be our year, Laura." I can feel it. I leaned into his embrace and smiled because he was absolutely right. 2024 was going to be our year, just not in the way he imagined. The final piece of my preparation came in mid January, when Mark made a crucial mistake. He had been growing increasingly careless about his phone, leaving it unlocked on the counter while he showered or took business calls. On a Wednesday evening, while he was on a conference call in his office, I managed to access his text messages and forward the most damning conversations to my own phone. What I found was worse than I had imagined. Mark wasn't just planning to leave me for Marilyn. He was planning to claim that I had manipulated Evelyn into changing her will while she was incapacitated from her stroke. He was going to argue that the apartment rightfully belonged to him as Evelyn's only child, and that I had taken advantage of an elderly woman's medical vulnerability. In a text to someone named Richard, probably his lawyer, Mark wrote, "The old lady was barely coherent after the stroke. Any will she signed during that period could be challenged. Laura was there every day, basically coaching her. It's obvious manipulation." Another message sent just 3 days earlier. "Laura thinks she's so smart, playing nurse to my mother. She has no idea what's coming. By the time I'm done, she'll be lucky to walk away with her clothes." Reading those messages, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about divorce anymore. This was about a man who was prepared to destroy both his wife and his mother to get what he wanted. This was about someone who viewed love and loyalty as weaknesses to be exploited. I forwarded the messages to David and to Sarah, then deleted them from my phone. Mark would never know I had seen them, but now I knew exactly what kind of fight he was planning. That night, I lay awake beside my husband and listened to him sleep peacefully, completely unaware that he had just handed me the ammunition I needed to destroy him completely. The papers were served on a Tuesday morning in March, while Mark was having coffee and reading the Tribune in our kitchen. I had left early for a doctor's appointment, or so I told him. In reality, I was sitting in Sarah's office, watching through the window as a process server walked up to our building. "He's going to call you," Sarah warned. "He's going to be furious and confused, and he's going to demand explanations." "I know," I said, turning off my phone, "but he's not going to get them. Not from me." The divorce papers were comprehensive. I was seeking dissolution of the marriage on grounds of adultery, with evidence of infidelity attached. I was claiming ownership of the Lincoln Park apartment based on Evelyn's legal transfer of the property. And I was requesting spousal support based on the career sacrifices I had made during our marriage. But the real surprise was the second set of papers, an eviction notice. Since the apartment was legally mine, and since Mark had no lease agreement or rental contract, he had 30 days to vacate the premises. My phone rang 17 times that morning. I didn't answer. At noon, Mark appeared at my office. I was in a meeting with clients, but he convinced the receptionist to interrupt me by claiming there was a family emergency. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, waving the papers as I walked into the reception area. The entire office could hear him, and I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. "It's a divorce petition, Mark." I assume you can read." "This is insane," he said, his voice rising. "You can't just throw me out of my own apartment. You can't claim ownership of property that belongs to my family." "Actually, I can," I said calmly. "The apartment belongs to me. Your mother transferred ownership 3 months ago. It's all legal and properly documented." Mark's face went through several colors: red, then white, then red again. "You manipulated her." She was sick, confused. "You took advantage of an old woman who didn't know what she was signing." "Your mother was completely competent when she signed the transfer papers," I replied. "She had her own lawyer present, and she was examined by 2 independent physicians who certified her mental capacity. It's all in the documentation." "This is extortion," Mark said, loud enough that people in the neighboring offices probably heard him. "You're trying to destroy me because you're jealous and bitter, and you can't stand the fact that I've outgrown our marriage." I looked at him for a long moment, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in 15 years. He was a middle-aged man having a temper tantrum in a public place because he had been caught lying. He looked pathetic. "I'm not destroying you, Mark," I said quietly. "I'm just stopping you from destroying me." He stormed out, leaving me to face the curious stares of my coworkers and the uncomfortable silence that follows a public scene. But I felt, oddly, calm. The confrontation I had been dreading for months was over, and I had survived it. That evening, I came home to find Mark packing furiously in our bedroom. Clothes were scattered across the bed, and he was throwing things into suitcases with the desperate energy of someone who had finally realized the game was over. "Where are you going?" I asked from the doorway. "Hotel," he said, without looking at me, "until I can figure out how to fight this insanity. You could also just sign the papers and make this easy for both of us." He stopped packing and turned to face me. For a moment, I thought he might try to have an actual conversation, but then his expression hardened. "You think you're so smart," he said. "You think you've got everything figured out. But I know things about you too, Laura. I know what you did to my mother, how you isolated her from her friends, how you convinced her that I didn't care about her. I never said anything negative about you to your mother." I replied truthfully, "I didn't have to." "Your actions spoke for themselves." "We'll see what a judge thinks about that," Mark said, zipping up a suitcase with unnecessary force. "We'll see what happens when I explain how you took advantage of a stroke victim to steal property that rightfully belongs to me." I watched him pack for a few more minutes, then went to the kitchen to make myself dinner. I wasn't cooking for two anymore. Mark left that night with 3 suitcases and a threat to destroy me in court. He also left behind a mess that told the story of 15 years better than any testimony could. Unpaid bills he had hidden from me, credit card statements for purchases I had never seen, and business documents that revealed his real estate empire was mostly imaginary. Over the next 2 weeks, the true extent of Mark's deception became clear. The Milwaukee apartment where he had been meeting Marilyn, he had been paying for it with cash advances from credit cards that were already maxed out. The big deals he was always closing. Most of them existed only in his imagination and his conversations with gullible investors. Mark Anderson, successful commercial real estate developer, was actually Mark Anderson, Ambitious man deeply in debt who had been using his wife's stability and his mother's property as collateral for dreams he couldn't afford. But none of that prepared me for what happened next. 3 weeks after Mark moved out, Evelyn called me with news that changed everything. "Laura, I need you to come over," she said. "Mark was just here, and we need to talk." I found Evelyn in her kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea that had grown cold while she waited for me. She looked older than she had just days before, as if the conversation with her son had aged her in real time. "What did he want?" I asked, sitting down across from her. "He wanted me to sign papers saying I was incompetent when I transferred the apartment to you," she said. "He brought a lawyer with him. They said if I signed the papers, he would drop his claim against me for elder abuse." I felt my stomach drop. Elder abuse? He's claiming that you isolated me from him, that you fed me lies about his character to turn me against him. He says you manipulated me into signing over the apartment while I was suffering from post-stroke dementia. Evelyn, you know that's not true. "Of course I know it's not true," she said firmly. "But Mark doesn't care about truth. He cares about winning. And he thinks if he can prove I was incompetent, he can get the apartment back and destroy you in the process." I sat in Evelyn's kitchen and felt the ground shift beneath me. Mark wasn't just fighting the divorce. He was trying to frame me for elder abuse. If he succeeded, I could face criminal charges, lose my job, and be destroyed both financially and professionally. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him to get out of my house," Evelyn said. "And then I called my lawyer." That afternoon, sitting in the office of Evelyn's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Fleming who specialized in elder law, I learned that Mark's strategy was more sophisticated than I had given him credit for. "He's not just claiming incompetence," Margaret explained. "He's claiming undue influence. The argument is that Laura isolated Mrs. Anderson from her son, filled her mind with lies about his character, and then pressured her to sign over valuable property while she was vulnerable from her medical condition." "But that's completely false," I said. "Truth and legal strategy are often unrelated," Margaret replied. "Mark has a credible case if he can convince a judge that his mother was susceptible to influence and that Laura had both the opportunity and the motive to manipulate her." "What kind of evidence would he need?" Evelyn asked. "Testimony from medical professionals about post-stroke vulnerability. Evidence that Laura was the primary caregiver during the recovery period. Documentation that you had little contact with your son during the time the transfer was arranged. Character witnesses who could testify that the decision was out of character for you." I looked at Evelyn. "He could actually win this." "Not if we're prepared," Margaret said. "Not if we have better evidence and better witnesses than he does." That evening, I called Sarah and David for an emergency meeting. Sitting in Sarah's conference room at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, I laid out Mark's new strategy and what it meant for our case. "He's trying to destroy you completely," Sarah said after I finished. "It's not enough for him to win the divorce. He wants to leave you with nothing, no apartment, no reputation, no future." "Can he do it?" I asked. David opened a folder, thick with surveillance photos and audio transcripts. "Not if we play this right." "Mark has made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" "He doesn't know how much evidence we have," David said. "He doesn't know about the recordings of his conversations with Marilyn. He doesn't know we documented every trip to Milwaukee. Every lie he told you, every credit card charge for his secret life. Sarah was nodding as she flipped through David's reports. This is better than we thought. Mark isn't just an adulterer, he's a fraud. He's been lying to everyone about his business success, his financial situation, and his intentions. But will that be enough to stop him from claiming I manipulated Evelyn? It will be enough to destroy his credibility, Sarah said. And it will be enough to show the judge exactly what kind of man we're dealing with. Over the next month, as we prepared for what was beginning to look like a trial rather than a simple divorce proceeding, more evidence emerged that painted a picture of Mark's character that even I hadn't fully understood. David's investigation revealed that Mark had been lying to Marilyn as well. The pregnant woman in Milwaukee thought Mark was separated from his wife and waiting for a divorce to be finalized. She had no idea that Mark was still living with me, still sharing my bed, still playing the role of devoted husband while planning his escape. She's not the enemy, I told David during one of our meetings. She's another victim. Do you want me to contact her? David asked. Her testimony could be crucial if she's willing to admit that Mark lied to her about his marital status. It undermines his claim that he's a trustworthy person who's being unfairly accused. I thought about the woman I had seen in Milwaukee, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly, her face glowing with the happiness of someone who believed she was loved. Did I have the right to destroy her illusions for the sake of my legal case? But then I remembered Mark's text messages, his casual dismissal of me as not my problem anymore, his willingness to frame me for elder abuse to get what he wanted. And I realized that Marilyn deserved to know the truth about the man who had fathered her child. Contact her, I said, but be gentle. She's going to learn that her entire relationship is built on lies. David reached out to Marilyn through a mutual friend, a real estate agent who knew both David and Marilyn's landlord. The approach was subtle and careful, designed to give Marilyn information without making her feel attacked or manipulated. The response was swift and devastating. Marilyn agreed to meet with David, and what she revealed changed everything about Mark's case. Not only had Mark lied to her about being separated, he had also lied about his financial situation, his business prospects, and his intentions regarding their relationship. He told me he was waiting for his divorce to be finalized before we could get married, Marilyn explained during a recorded interview. He said his wife was being vindictive and trying to take everything from him, but that once the legal issues were resolved, we could start our real life together. Did he ever mention that he was still living with his wife? David asked. He said he was staying in the apartment temporarily until the property settlement was worked out. He made it sound like they were essentially roommates at that point. What about his business? Did he discuss his financial situation with you? Marilyn's voice became quieter, more uncertain. He said he was involved in several major development projects, that he was about to close some big deals that would set us up for life. He paid for the apartment, took me to nice restaurants. I had no reason to question it. Did he ask you for money? Not directly. But when I got pregnant, he said his cash flow was temporarily tight because of the divorce proceedings. I gave him $15,000 from my savings account to help with legal fees. $15,000. Mark had taken money from his pregnant mistress to fund his lies to both of us. When Sarah played Marilyn's recorded statement for me, I had to stop the playback twice. Hearing the pain in her voice as she realized the extent of Mark's deception was almost unbearable. "She's agreed to testify," Sarah said when the recording ended. "She wants to make sure Mark faces consequences for what he's done." "What about the baby?" I asked. "She's planning to raise the child alone. She says she never wants to see Mark again." 3 days before our court date, Mark made one last attempt to control the narrative. He called me at home on a Sunday evening, his voice calm and reasonable, in a way that immediately put me on guard. "Laura, I think we need to talk. We can talk through our lawyers," I replied. "Please, this doesn't have to be a war. We can work something out that's fair for everyone." "I'm listening. I'll sign the divorce papers and give up any claim to spousal support. You can keep the apartment. In exchange, you drop the adultery charges and don't contest my visitation rights with my mother." I almost laughed. Even now, when his lies were about to be exposed in open court, Mark was trying to negotiate as if he had something to offer. "What about Marilyn?" I asked. There was a pause. "What about her? Are you planning to marry her? Support your child?" "That's not really any of your business anymore, is it?" "It is if you're asking me to keep quiet about your adultery. It is if you're trying to present yourself as an honest man who made some mistakes instead of a fraud who's been lying to everyone in his life for months. Laura, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be." "No, Mark, you made it complicated. I'm just making sure everyone knows the truth." He hung up without saying goodbye. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in early May. Mark appeared in court wearing his most expensive suit, looking every inch the successful businessman he pretended to be. His lawyer, Richard Goldman, was clearly expensive and clearly confident. I wore a simple blue dress and sat beside Sarah, feeling like David facing Goliath. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over the proceedings with the efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of human dishonesty and disappointment. She listened to Mark's opening statement with a neutral expression, as Richard Goldman painted me as a manipulative woman who had taken advantage of an elderly stroke victim. "Your Honor," Goldman said, "this case is fundamentally about elder abuse disguised as marriage dissolution." Mrs. Anderson isolated her mother-in-law from her only son during a period of medical vulnerability, filled the elderly woman's mind with lies and suspicions, and then pressured her to sign over valuable property. The apartment in question is worth approximately $400,000, and Mrs. Anderson obtained it through undue influence and emotional manipulation. When it was Sarah's turn to present our case, she stood up with a thick folder of evidence and expression of barely contained satisfaction. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about manipulation and lies, but not the kind Mr. Goldman is describing. Over the next several hours, we will present evidence that Mr. Anderson is a serial liar who has been deceiving his wife, his mother, and his pregnant mistress for over a year. We will show that he is financially insolvent, that his business success is largely fictional, and that he has attempted to frame his wife for elder abuse to cover up his own moral and financial bankruptcy." The first witness was Evelyn. Watching Mark's mother take the witness stand was one of the most difficult moments of the entire proceedings. She walked slowly to the front of the courtroom, her cane tapping against the floor, her head held high, despite the obvious pain of what she was about to do. Sarah's questioning was gentle but thorough. "Mrs. Anderson, can you describe your relationship with your daughter-in-law prior to your stroke. We were cordial, but not close, Evelyn said clearly. I had reservations about Laura when Mark first married her. I thought she wasn't good enough for my son. What changed your mind? When I had my stroke, Laura was the only one who showed up. She sat beside my hospital bed for 3 days while Mark was supposedly closing some business deal in Milwaukee. She learned how to help me with physical therapy, drove me to medical appointments, and never once complained about the burden I was placing on her life. Did she ever say anything negative about your son? Never. If anything, she made excuses for him. When I complained that he wasn't visiting enough, she would say he was working hard to provide for the family. When I wondered why he seemed distracted during his brief visits, she would say he was worried about my health. When did you decide to transfer ownership of the apartment to Laura? Evelyn's voice became stronger, more decisive. After my second stroke, when I realized I could have died and my son wouldn't have been there to hold my hand. Laura had sacrificed her career to take care of me, and Mark had sacrificed nothing. I wanted to make sure that if something happened to me, Laura wouldn't be left homeless and dependent on a man who had already proven he couldn't be depended upon. Were you mentally competent when you made this decision? I had 2 independent psychological evaluations confirming my competence. I had my own attorney present for the signing, and I made the decision over a period of several weeks, not in a moment of confusion or emotional distress. When Richard Goldman cross-examined Evelyn, he was respectful but persistent. Mrs. Anderson, isn't it true that you were on several medications that can affect judgment and memory? I was on blood thinners and blood pressure medication, nothing that affected my mental capacity. Isn't it true that Laura was your primary source of information about your son's activities during your recovery? Laura told me very little about Mark's activities. I formed my own opinions based on his absence and his attitude when he did visit. If your son had been more attentive during your recovery, would you still have transferred the apartment to Laura? Evelyn paused, considering the question carefully. Mr. Goldman, if my son had been more attentive during my recovery, I wouldn't have needed to transfer the apartment to anyone. Laura would have been secure in her marriage, and I would have been secure in my son's love. But that's not what happened. The second day of testimony focused on Mark's financial deception and his affair with Marilyn. David took the stand first, presenting a methodical account of months of surveillance. Photos of Mark entering and leaving Marilyn's apartment building. Restaurant receipts for expensive dinners charged to maxed-out credit cards. Hotel records showing overnight stays that coincided with supposed business trips. But the most damaging evidence was the audio recordings. Sarah played selected excerpts for the court, and Mark's voice filled the courtroom as he described his marriage as a mistake, his wife as an obstacle, and his plans to abandon both his mother and his spouse for his pregnant mistress. Once this big deal closes, we can make this official, Mark's voice said through the courtroom speakers. I'll tell Laura everything, get the divorce finalized, and we can move forward with our real life. Judge Morrison listened to the recordings without visible emotion, but I could see Mark shifting uncomfortably in his chair. These weren't allegations or interpretations. These were his own words, recorded without his knowledge, revealing the calculated nature of his deception. When Marilyn took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. She was 7 months pregnant now, her condition obvious, and her dignity intact, despite the circumstances that had brought her here. She spoke quietly but clearly about her relationship with Mark, the lies he had told her, and the financial fraud he had committed against her. He told me he was separated from his wife and waiting for the divorce to be finalized, she testified. He said the delay was because she was being vindictive and trying to take everything from him. I gave him $15,000 to help with legal fees because I believed we were building a life together. Did you know he was still living with his wife? Sarah asked. I had no idea. If I had known, I never would have gotten involved with him. What are your plans now? I'm going to raise my child alone. I never want to see Mark Anderson again. During cross-examination, Richard Goldman tried to suggest that Marilyn was a disgruntled mistress seeking revenge, but her quiet dignity and obvious pain made his implications seem cruel and desperate. When Mark finally took the stand in his own defense, he was a different man than the confident businessman who had entered the courtroom 3 days earlier. His testimony was a masterpiece of deflection and self-pity. He admitted to the affair, but claimed it was the result of feeling neglected in his marriage. He admitted to lying about his financial situation, but claimed he was protecting me from worry. He even admitted to taking money from Marilyn, but claimed it was a loan he intended to repay. But when Sarah cross-examined him, the careful construction of his defense fell apart. Mr. Anderson, when you told Marilyn that your wife was being vindictive in the divorce proceedings, were you referring to divorce proceedings that hadn't actually been filed yet? The relationship was effectively over. We were just waiting for the paperwork. But you were still living together, sleeping in the same bed, presenting yourselves as a married couple to friends and family? Mark's pause was telling. The situation was complicated. Was it complicated? Or were you lying to Marilyn about your marital status? I was trying to protect her from unnecessary stress during her pregnancy. Were you also trying to protect her when you took $15,000 from her savings account? That was a temporary loan to help with business expenses. What business expenses? According to your financial records, you're approximately $80,000 in debt. You haven't closed a real estate deal in over 18 months, and most of your supposed investor meetings were actually dinner dates with Marilyn. Mark's face flushed red. My business has faced some temporary setbacks. Temporary setbacks or complete failure? Richard Goldman objected. But Judge Morrison allowed the question. My business is recovering, Mark said weakly. Recovering from what? From the fact that it never really existed in the first place? That question hung in the air for a long moment before Mark answered. I've had some difficulties, but that doesn't mean I deserve to lose my inheritance or my relationship with my mother. Mr. Anderson, what inheritance are you referring to? The apartment that your mother legally transferred to your wife? The property that you have no legal claim to? That apartment should have come to me as her son. Should have, according to whom? According to family tradition, according to what's right, but not according to the law, and not according to your mother's wishes. Mark's silence was answer enough. Sarah's final question was devastating in its simplicity. Mr. Anderson, of all the people you've lied to over the past year, your wife, your mother, your mistress, your creditors, is there anyone you've been honest with? Mark looked around the courtroom as if searching for an answer that would save him. His eyes met mine for a moment, and I saw something I had never seen before: complete defeat. "I've made mistakes," he said quietly. "That's not what I asked. I asked if there's anyone you've been honest with." "No," he admitted. "I haven't been honest with anyone." Judge Morrison recessed for deliberation, and we waited in the hallway outside the courtroom for 2 hours. Mark sat at the far end of the hall with his lawyer, not speaking, staring at the floor, like a man who had finally run out of lies to tell. Evelyn sat beside me, her hand resting on my arm. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "I think so," I said. "Are you?" "I'm sad," she admitted, "but I'm not sorry. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way." When Judge Morrison returned, the courtroom fell silent. "This case," she began, "presents a clear example of the difference between making mistakes and engaging in deliberate deception. Mr. Anderson hasn't simply had an affair or made poor financial decisions. He has constructed an elaborate web of lies that has caused significant harm to multiple people, including his wife, his mother, and the mother of his unborn child." She looked directly at Mark. "The evidence shows that you are financially insolvent, that you have been lying about your business success for over a year, and that you have attempted to manipulate legal proceedings by making false claims about your wife's treatment of your mother." Then she turned to me. "Mrs. Anderson, the court finds no evidence that you exercised undue influence over your mother-in-law. To the contrary, the evidence shows that you provided exceptional care for an elderly woman while receiving no support from her son. The final ruling was comprehensive and complete. The divorce was granted on grounds of adultery and abandonment. I was awarded the apartment, spousal support for 2 years, and half of the remaining marital assets, which, given Mark's debts, amounted to very little. Mark's claims of elder abuse and undue influence were dismissed entirely. But the most satisfying moment came when Judge Morrison addressed Mark's character. "Mr. Anderson, this court has rarely seen such a systematic pattern of deception and financial irresponsibility. You have lied to your wife, your mother, and the mother of your child. You have taken money under false pretenses and attempted to use the legal system to cover up your own misconduct. While this court cannot repair the damage you have done to your relationships, it can ensure that you face the legal consequences of your actions." As we left the courthouse, Mark made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his lies. "Laura!" he called out as I walked toward the parking garage. "Hmm? Can we talk?" I stopped and turned to face him. He looked older than he had just a week before, as if the weight of his exposed deception had physically aged him. "What do you want, Mark?" "I want to explain." "Explain what?" "That you're a liar and a fraud, that you took advantage of everyone who cared about you. I think you've explained enough." "I never meant for it to go this far." "You never meant to get caught," I corrected. "There's a difference." He stood there in the afternoon sunlight, a man who had lost everything through his own choices. And for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I hope you find a way to be honest with your child," I said. "He or she deserves better than what you gave the rest of us." I walked away without looking back. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my apartment, watching the sun set over Lake Michigan. The same view that once seemed like a prison now feels like freedom. Evelyn comes for dinner every Sunday. She's walking without a cane now, and her speech is completely normal. She never mentions Mark unless I ask, and I rarely ask. Some wounds heal better in silence. I've returned to work full time at the PR firm, and last month I was offered the promotion I had turned down 3 years ago to care for Evelyn. I said yes this time because I've learned that taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. I think about Mark sometimes, but not with anger anymore. I think about him with the kind of detached curiosity you might feel for a stranger whose life story you've read in the newspaper. The man I was married to for 15 years turns out to have been largely fictional, a character Mark created to get what he wanted from people who were foolish enough to love him. The real Mark is raising his child in Milwaukee, working at a hardware store, and living in a studio apartment he can barely afford. Marilyn sends me a Christmas card every year with a photo of their daughter, a beautiful little girl who looks exactly like her father, but hopefully inherited her mother's character. I'm dating someone now, a kind, quiet man named David who works as a librarian and has never once lied to me about anything, even when the truth was embarrassing or inconvenient. We're taking things slowly, building something real on a foundation of honesty instead of manipulation. But the most important relationship I've rebuilt is the one with myself. For 15 years, I defined my worth through Mark's approval and my value through my willingness to sacrifice everything for his comfort. I thought love meant erasure, that being a good wife meant disappearing into someone else's dreams. Now, I know better. Love isn't about sacrifice without reciprocation. Love isn't about silence in the face of betrayal. Love isn't about accepting lies because the truth is inconvenient. Real love is built on honesty, respect, and the radical idea that both people in a relationship deserve to be seen, heard, and valued. The apartment where I now live alone is filled with things that make me happy: books I choose, music I enjoy, furniture that reflects my taste rather than his. It's smaller than the life I thought I wanted, but it's entirely mine. Sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, I think about other women who might be living the life I once lived, making excuses for men who don't deserve them, sacrificing dreams for people who wouldn't sacrifice anything in return, staying silent when they should be speaking the truth. If you're one of those women, if you're reading this story and recognizing yourself in the role of the faithful wife, the devoted caregiver, the woman who always puts everyone else first, I want you to know something. Your silence doesn't have to be permanent. Your sacrifices don't have to be endless. Your story doesn't have to end with someone else's happiness built on your erasure. The truth is a powerful thing, but it requires courage to speak it. Justice is possible, but it requires preparation to achieve it. Freedom is available, but it requires the willingness to choose yourself, even when everyone around you has taught you that choosing yourself is selfish. I chose myself, and I didn't lose everything. I lost a man who never really loved me, a marriage that was built on lies, and a life that was never really mine to begin with. What I gained was so much more valuable: dignity, honesty, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that when someone tried to erase me, I refused to disappear. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, if you've ever been taken for granted by people who should have cherished you, if you've ever had to choose between being kind and being respected, then you know the power of finding your voice. The strongest victories aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes, The most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept lies as love, manipulation as care, or silence as peace. Have you ever had to fight for your own dignity? Have you ever discovered that the person you trusted most was living a completely different life behind your back? Share your story in the comments below, because every woman who finds the courage to speak her truth makes it easier for the next woman to do the same. If this story reminded you that you're stronger than you think, that truth is more powerful than lies, and that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary, then subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Because every woman deserves to know that her voice matters, her truth is valid, and her story isn't over yet. When a woman finally stops being silent, the whole world listens.